to start off with, this is kind of was created as a topic that really kind of helps to frame cloud services in terms of what do I do today and how does it represent a bit of a paradigm shift away from conventional IT services and that we provide within our infrastructure. So to really start with, I'm going to kind of go through a cloud primer. I'm going to talk about kind of the emergency of cloud services, and also one of the things that we're heavily involved with, obviously, is at OTEC. And so I've got Chad here. He'll be able to address a number of the things as it relates to, you know, OTEC's position about cloud services and how they're going to play into this ability to offer services to the agencies. Talk about what's the problem, the business paradigm shift, kind of some value drivers, a way to look at how you can calculate ROI based on, you know, things that you already understand and are already spending and already budgeting for, and how you can potentially leverage these types of services to offset or augment your infrastructure and services offerings, a risk assessment, as well as a little bit of a takeaway of cloud strategies. And I'm going to try and condense this down. This is a presentation I've previously done. It took me about an hour and a half, so if I sound a little bit like one of the chipmunks kind of going through, squeezing the stuff, you'll have to forgive me. Okay, so just a couple of little fact points here to start with. The world's information is doubling every 2 years. 1.8 trillion gigabytes will be created and replicated. 70% of IT budgets are spent on maintaining current IT infrastructures, and only 30% are typically spent on new capabilities. 15% of data centers don't have any backup or recovery plan. 30% don't have backup sites. And this was kind of based on a survey that was conducted by Northbridge Venture Partners. 26% of the respondents reported any decrease in hiring based on cloud adoption. So just out of curiosity, how many of you think that adopting cloud somehow represents a significant reduction in costs? Anybody? Oh, that's cool. Then I won't have to convince you of really kind of the virtues. Okay, so let's start a little bit. So for some people, cloud looks like this, right? Little part, huh?
There's no pie in it.
And for the technical people, cloud looks like this. But ultimately, what is cloud? So it's a utility computing model. Pay for what you use, outsource manageability and maintenance, easily adjust to fluctuating and unpredictable business demand. And the reason this is important is this last little bullet point, which is elasticity and agility. Point being is that if you think about the typical capital budget cycle and equipment acquisition or product acquisition and implementation and life cycles, you guys take a risk on the front end to kind of plan what you think you want to do with your best gathering of information, and from that you establish a budget of what you think it's going to take. What happens if you're wrong? What happens if you've undersized your need? Conversely, what happens if you've oversized your need? So ultimately, when you're looking at cloud, one of the ways that you look at it is really about risk mitigation. It's about the notion that you can identify what your needs are and be able to take a look at different solutions. But the key part about it is that you have how you have to invest yourself into it is different. Instead of the traditional CapEx model, we're going to go purchase all this equipment, pay for all the implementation, get the thing up and running, try and deal with the KT and figure out how in the world we're going to operate it and govern it. This is a very different model, because a lot of basically emergence of cloud started as, hey, it's just a commodity. We build a bunch of servers, it's just a data center. We put a bunch of applications out there, it's just a service. And then hopefully people will come. Well, the challenge has been adoption's not been as quick as a lot of cloud providers have hoped for. And so the real challenge becomes, how do you position the cloud offering to really meet the business needs of our customer, as opposed to thinking that we're going to somehow just create a bunch of infrastructure and, you know, it's kind of the, what is it, build it and they will come kind of mentality. So really, so looking at the different types of configurations, and most of this is pretty elementary, but just for the purposes of kind of running through this. A private cloud serves a single organization, can be internally managed or outsourced, services built upon virtualized managed infrastructure. Self-provisioning of resources. How many folks here are kind of looking at their own cloud internal infrastructures? Curious. Anybody here? Yes, no, somewhat? Then the notion of, do you have tenants? Do you have customers? So like, for example, with agencies, you might have individual departments that might be your tenants. And then to thinking about how am I going to deal with things such as the, for example, chargeback model or allocation model, or what is affectionately being termed the showback model. So how do you manage all that? Ultimately, when you start to look into, I'm going to deal with a private cloud, you're charged with the notion of how you're going to do this. And because the technology is evolving so quickly, there are problems that you have not even yet begin to understand. So there's part of this challenge of, even you look at vendors like VMware and their focus on their product suite and what is it, and what are a number of the technology advances on the platform. What are they all about? They're all about management. So ultimately, in a private cloud scenario, those things have to be considered, especially if it's you providing services as a service provider. Here's another one, usage metering. Is this a cost allocation model where you have a bunch of constituents that come together and then based on some predetermined pro rata allocation of the services? Or are you going to take this as a true commodity service-based model, kind of like an Amazon does, and you price your services based on some metric that you can apply, and you also have to have some set of tools that you can actually assign to be able to manage and monitor that, and then ultimately you have to also figure out how in the world am I going to bill for it and how am I going to get paid for it. Serves multiple tenants, comprised of one or more data centers, utility consumption model. Right now we see pretty much, email is a big one, as we've seen with the Office 365 CES project. That's a good, that was kind of the forerunner, the entry-level foray into cloud services for the state. But some of the other things that are looking at and trying, again, I'll leave that to Chad to discuss because he deals with OTEC a lot about the matrix of cloud services they're looking at. Storage, certainly software, CPU, RAM, and network bandwidth. Network is another interesting thing that is really starting to change the landscape of what we see, because we're kind of all stuck in this traditional model of we have, pick a vendor, Cisco, Brocade, whoever, HP, and we fixate on the capabilities of back in the day it was all about routers, and then all of a sudden switches got way smarter. And then we could do things with VLANs and other things that allowed us to emulate and mimic kind of what the functionality of the router was, but now I get to do it in a switch. Well, now these days I have virtual appliances. So all that every single one of these devices was governed by an operating system, which these days, VMware is in the big business of virtualizing all kinds of stuff. Appliances, a lot of you have probably seen the drive and move towards shifting of those types of traditionally hardware-bound services and capabilities now being driven into the virtual infrastructure. So there's a number of companies, for example, like with network bandwidth, the interesting thing is they offer network as a service. They actually have portals where you can go in and configure your entire network layout and infrastructure. And what it does is based on how you've configured it, it downloads the configuration into your hardware or into your virtual environment. So hybrid, and this is one of the things that is going to be interesting to see how we deploy this. It's a combination of local and remote resources. So when you think about it today, a lot of times you guys have integration between applications or integration between departments, or, I mean, in our world, within the state, what ends up happening is a department today is a department somewhere else tomorrow, or sucked into an agency, or however that ends up working. So ultimately, you end up with this kind of hybridized model of figuring out, okay, how am I going to manage all this stuff? When I'm in a physical infrastructure, it's pretty difficult. The difficulty doesn't go away when I move into a cloud-based architecture or infrastructure. The problems still exist. The skill sets of how I'm going to solve that problem still need to be available to be able to work my way through these. There's a lot of thoughts now that I can move all this stuff out to the cloud, but ultimately, if I've got levels of integration, do I have the necessary bandwidth to support now throughput to this adjunct application that's out there in the cloud? So a lot of you are probably facing this today, as you start to move your applications off-site and realizing I better have thought ahead about the impact on my bandwidth requirements. We're dealing with a number of virtualization projects where they're struggling between the whole, do I go with the data center centric model where everything is in one huge data center and everybody remotes into that either through VDI or even across the wire as clients. But ultimately, the bandwidth becomes the kind of the driver of whether or not I can pull that off. And then also from a risk mitigation, risk management situation, what do you do if one of those major links goes down? So now mission critical in your consolidated environment became very difficult to manage if in your private cloud, hybrid cloud-based scenario, your WAN link or goes down. All of a sudden, you're in a very interesting dilemma of, okay, now how am I going to resolve this? It's a strategic alternative to pure private or pure public cloud. This is kind of an interesting thing that it's going to be, I think, a little time before the state gets to the point where they can adopt this or really think about this. But one of the things that's happened in the commercial space is the notion that proof of concepts are becoming kind of the rule of thumb of how people go about adoption. Because ultimately, there are so many different proof points that you have to be able to validate before you can actually think about implementing the type of investment of moving to cloud. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the other gotchas of things that you need to think about in the event that your trial or your proof or your actual implementation didn't work, and how in the heck you get yourself out. Okay, so talking about the emergence of cloud services, pretty much these days, sky's the limit. Any service that you think that you can run in your enterprise, you can run in the cloud. I'm going to let Chad talk a little bit about kind of OTEC's stance and based on.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chad Hodges, and I'm one of the principals here at ENS as well. And when we're talking about cloud as a service, as it relates to the state of California, you guys have all heard Ron Hughes, the director at OTEC, talk more and more about how the kinds of services that he'd like to see coming out of OTEC. He'd really like to see OTEC start driving towards more of a service-oriented model where they become a broker to get you access to all kinds of services. And so there are RFOs and RFPs being developed right now internally and scoped and developed. There's a couple of departments that are being asked to participate in those exercises as well. And it's actually a really kind of exciting time, right? So the first one that they're actually developing is infrastructure as a service, where it's a vendor provided solution that can actually land on the white floor and basically provide you utility power, utility compute power, whether that be storage, whether that be servers, but actually be able to turn up virtual infrastructure and be able to be elastic and move forward with whatever your business initiatives are and turn VMs up quickly. So that's the first endeavor. There's also going to be things like public cloud, which can include a number of, if we tab through this, you can actually see all the different things that can start developing after infrastructure. You can have platform software, DR, storage, network security, communication, database monitoring, printing. We affectionately call this everything as a service. It's something that the industry is fast approaching, and if you can develop it and build it on site, you can put it in the cloud as well. And so we're seeing that proliferation starting to happen. So OTEC's fast driving towards that. It's a pretty major endeavor, a great partnership between DGS and OTEC, so it's been kind of interesting to participate in that effort and see how it's progressed, how collaborative it's been. But they've also learned a lot of lessons. There's a number of departments already that have moved towards this broker system where they've actually been the facilitator and they built the infrastructure, and then they have constituents, or tenants that actually are doing that. We have the folks at CDCR. I know they're here. We've got DWR that's participated in activities like that with the FTC, and DWR's consolidation at an agency level where they have multiple tenants. So it's kind of an exciting time, and it's a model that flushed out a lot of lessons learned. So the state's trying to say, okay, now how do we do that at the state data center? How do we make sure that this is a service that we can provide and really just be the broker? And then we can provide those either on-site as our own service, they can be vendor managed, they can be multiple services in the cloud from all kinds of multiple vendors. You'll see this proliferation starting to occur as well if you have been keeping an eye on the recent CSSI bids, the CalNet 3 bids. You're not going to have one or two vendors anymore. You're going to have a lot more vendors in cloud because there's just so many different things that can be provided as a service. So you don't, as a state of California, you're finding yourself not wanting to limit your options, and cloud's really opening the skies open for you so you can do a lot more things with the services that you want. And things that are meaningful to your business, not just to IT anymore. Because in the past it's been, well, what can you do for me? And IT is having to kind of shift its mindset and say, okay, what business problem am I trying to solve as opposed to what infrastructure am I going to build today or what servers am I going to buy and hopefully in 6 to 8 weeks they get here, and then I install them, and hopefully I don't have a director or secretary coming down, breathing down my neck. So you're trying to be more agile, you're trying to be more fluid, and we're seeing this big shift towards really understanding what business requirements are, translating those into some technical requirements, and whether or not cloud can facilitate that is really dependent on a couple of different factors, not the least of which is cost. Obviously, we have to be cost conscious, but also time frames. Different legislative mandates create time structure that is sometimes impossible to do ourselves in-house, so cloud can facilitate making those things happen quicker. So there's just a lot of different factors that you have to consider. So
Thanks.
hopefully that helps.
I think ultimately, some of the things that and again, so here's kind of my personal barometer of how I measure this. So I look at the things that are happening in the industry. I look at the kind of the trends and what are developing. And I look at also kind of traditional vendors and how they're approaching solving problems. So for example, like an enterprise project, a product like Pega, which is a big BPM, and they're used to, they had franchise tax, they're building out that new tax framework. And those are great, gigantic, monolithic projects handled by gigantic SIs. Well, at the end of the day, if I'm trying to solve a problem for a mid-tier or mid-market with a much smaller need, that doesn't scale down for them. It makes it very, very difficult. So one of the things that they try and do is to understand I have to be able to provide proof points that allow you to limit the amount of risk that you take when you launch into a cloud service type of offering. And in this case, it's a development platform as a service. And ultimately, every single one of these, one of the things they're trying to do is to reduce the complexity of what you have to manage and take responsibility for it. But I have another slide that will talk a little bit about whether or not that really works or not. So what's the problem? Increasing scope and complexity of business needs. Technology is fast approaching a commodity state. Inability to satisfy and sustain staffing demands. Most of the agencies we work with, this is a huge problem. It's not that the technology capabilities aren't there. It's the how do I operationalize technology competencies. As a systems integrator and a services company, we're known for infrastructure. We've built out tons of virtual infrastructure in the state. And the thing is, we have awesome, incredible architects and engineers. And we're capable of really understanding what the requirements are, driving those home in our designs, rolling them out. We train your people for whatever amount of time we get to train them. And then ultimately, we hand over the keys. I kind of liken that to, I just handed the keys to my brand new Ferrari to my 16-year-old daughter. Now, although I really trust her because she's a good kid, the reality is if I don't keep an eye on her, the likelihood that she's going to run the thing into a pole is pretty high. And one of the challenges that we're seeing is that, part of the challenge here is dealing with the governance aspect. So when you look at really cloud models, one of the things is, at least ideally, they're focused, a cloud provider, a service provider is focused on really kind of the notion of the only way I'm able to make money is because I have efficiencies in my service delivery and my service capabilities. Because if not, I'm just you as a service provider, and ultimately what will suffer is my customers won't stay because I'm not very efficient about responding to their needs and I can't meet my SLAs. One of the interesting things is how many of you would actually be comfortable with publishing an SLA to your constituents? Anybody? Hard to do, right? Because you have a number of constraints that drive whether or not you can meet an SLA. Aging workforce. Here's another thing. We've been doing it this way for such a long time, and we have all this embodied knowledge in supporting the infrastructure, whether it be mainframe or whatever infrastructure I've got going on, and I've invested a lot of money in training them to support it. And now they're either going to another agency to take advantage of all that training I poured into them, or they're retiring. Budgetary constraints. And really, at the end of the day, it's trying to figure out how to do more with less. So let's talk about the business paradigm shift here. So traditionally, we've looked at owned assets. I'm an old dog in terms of IT. It was my stuff. I had a lot of pride in the choices that I made, the equipment that I purchased, the things that we trained and were able to support. And anytime anybody got in my face about change, I was not exactly the most receptive person in the crowd. Technology-driven versus business-driven. Again, things tended to be focused on sometimes the cool factor even, about what I was doing, the technology that was coming out. Look at all of these new capabilities. I can do all of these new things. And you know what, on this front, it really helps me a lot. But like we've noticed with a number of our clients, the unintended consequence was the complexity sprawled. And because of complexity sprawl, keeping up with the internal competencies and skill sets to actually maintain it as it became more complicated was more and more difficult. A lot of cloud providers, because they're designed around multi-tenancy, they're designed around servicing multiple constituents, they have to prepare a plan. Otherwise, all of that investment in infrastructure is going to be lost, because you'll leave as a customer because I can't meet SLAs. SLAs can be your best friend. Broad and deep IT skills versus specialized services. Again, when I'm, in the traditional sense, I would try and put people in place and understand technologies, send everybody to training under the sun, and at the end of the day, try and figure out how to manage what I had, and then tomorrow would come, and I would buy something new, and I'd try and figure out which people on the team I'm going to send to training to get that new stuff, and then I still got to figure out how to support the old stuff, and then it's a kind of a vicious cycle. It becomes very problematic and also very difficult to plan for, because at the end of the day, if I'm changing my technology cycles, changing my technology capabilities, I have a responsibility to figure out how I'm going to keep my skill sets to manage and maintain that up to snuff, and still do the everyday 8 to 5 job I've got. Long deployment cycles versus real-time delivery. Now here's an intriguing perspective. So normally when you take on any type of project, whether it be a solution-based or some infrastructure thing, sometimes the deployment cycles are way more drawn out than we would like them to be. Why? It's kind of like saying I want to overhaul my car. I want to overhaul the engine. But I don't have the luxury of pulling the sucker off to the side of the road to do the adequate level of service to be able to then get it back on the road in a timely fashion. So I'm struggling with the tension between business operations and maintenance and change. And I don't have the luxury of bringing on a whole nother staff of people to manage the change and the switch over. So I typically try and hire consultants which don't necessarily know that much about my business. And by the way, when they're done, they're leaving. So value drivers. IT tends to think about IT investments in terms of cost recovery, which is a wonderful thing. But the biggest benefit of private cloud computing is not going to be lower cost. This came out of the Gartner group. So really the value drivers, this is the hard part. And I know that with DWR, this is an area that they really tried to stress and focus on. And they realized after they rolled out their infrastructure that it was going to become an absolute necessity, is how they standardize their service delivery. Because the problem is, if everything becomes a one-off IT project for every single tenant, you're going to be caught up in the minutia of trying to solve every individual constituent's problem. Whereas one of the things that they ended up doing, and this was Tim Garza driving this bus, was the notion of I want a standardized template of what it is we do and to stick to it. Because as people would get caught up in the customization or the individual needs of an individual customer when that was not what they were providing within the scope of their service offering. Optimize utilization, again, so, in like the resource agencies where you've got all of these agencies that all had their individual data centers and then consolidating them onto one white floor, and then from there consolidating them again into a virtual infrastructure allowed them to optimize their utilization. Reduce cost of power, cooling, real estate, improve manageability. Again, you get a denser stack of hopefully higher skilled individuals to help support the infrastructure. Reliability and fault tolerance. That's one of the nice things about virtualization is the ability to be able to allow for certain failure throughout your system and still have not only reliable failover, but also maintaining a certain level of performance. A lot of things are we've been in the process of laying out a number of DR plans with agencies, and one of the things that becomes really challenging is there an expectation from the end user, if you fail this thing over, what is that going to be? Just to check the box and say, I've got it covered in my DRP, may or may not work for you, especially if you've got mission critical or maybe, in a conversation I had earlier, revenue-driven apps, where all of a sudden those types of things become very important. For example, maybe it's a billing and collections or accounting app. Maybe it's something that allows with distribution of benefits to our constituents. These are all things that in the planning, becomes very difficult, and that with, private cloud really need to be considered. Again, public-private, the access to skilled professionals. That's kind of the nice thing, is that in a service arrangement, they already know what they're doing, or theoretically, right? They know the scope of what their services engagements involve, and they're experts at it. And instead of you having to have a consultant per se on site dealing with it, you have access to these professionals within the scope of your subscription. It's an OpEx versus CapEx. Actually, in the last session I did, somebody actually asked this. Hopefully everybody understands that. Capitalization, meaning I write the big check up front. Operational expense, meaning it's something that I have in a recurring budget line item. And rapid deployment. Again, I don't have to wait for the hardware to be deployed. I don't have to wait for the software to be deployed. And in some cases, I was talking with one of the vendors here, they could do a rollout in a day. Now that's hard to imagine even any of us preparing our staff to deal with rollout of anything in a day. And this is the area that I think is the most value. Almost every vendor has a program that will allow you to develop a proof of concept. So it's kind of the show me this will work. And there are other things. So for example, when I say show me this will work, you need to think of it in a couple of different ways. One thing is I'll walk through the simple process of, like in the development, we used to call that the Hello World project. I write a code snippet, and when I hit enter, it pops up a smiley face and it says Hello World, and that was somehow to be derived as the proof of concept. I think in this case, because you're talking about a fully developed service offering, you can actually look at your proof of concept to be something that you actually would use, and probably more importantly, you can make them apply load testing to it to ensure that your actual needs from a performance perspective are being considered as part of your POC trial. So calculating ROI, one of the things that we're working with one of the agencies is the notion that I don't really have any money. But I know I've got some things coming up, or I know I'm already spending money on things. So as I start thinking about what's my capital investment, well, if I've already got investment in tech refresh that isn't additional budget costs, it's planned, that's probably a milestone that I want to start focusing and thinking about, okay, are there options in terms of how I could do this? Because if so, I could perhaps look at a tech refresh, for example, or a system upgrade as my avenue for going ahead and seeing what's possible. Having a vendor in, making them demonstrate what their capabilities are, being able to monitor, the effectiveness of their solution, and, figuring out whether or not their infrastructure is going to scale out, because that's the other big thing. The nice part about a vendor is you can hold them to an SLA. Our challenge would be, meaning as if I was a state agency, is what happens if I want to incrementally increase my capabilities? Walk it through. I go through a budgeting cycle, I go through a presentation, somebody has to approve it. Hopefully those funds are available. So by the time I actually get the money, I'm way down the road. And what happens if you overestimate it and you say, hey, man, I'd love to get some savings back because we're not actually using that much. You've spent the money, too late. Management efficiencies. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of these cloud offerings have a built-in management component, because they understand that they have to be able to monitor their environments, and so therefore they have tools in place to deal with the internal health of their systems. Now, I don't know how many of you do that inside your data centers, but ultimately the nice part about it is it allows me to leverage the things that the service provider thinks are important as metrics that measure their performance. And if I can make those customer facing, I can learn something. My people might learn something. Cost benefits of scale. So, I kind of look at it as, one of the concerns is for example, security. Well, we all struggle with security in our own little way because we are forced as individuals, agencies, to figure out best-of-breed solutions are, test it, validate it ourselves, roll it out, and figure out how to manage it. Well, when you think about companies like Terramark, Amazon, they're probably some of the most widely targeted hacking targets in the world. And the protocols and regimen that they have to apply to securing their stuff is at a much, much higher level and degree of risk than we face. So you have to ask yourself, to some degree, if that's the case, how much more risk would I take on going with them versus trying to do it myself? Now, granted, there's going to be some agencies, like CDCR, that are so good at it because they've been dealing with this for so long that they know how to secure their environments and they know how to, test their vulnerabilities. But that's not going to be widespread across the agencies. And plus, we don't have a standard protocol for how we go about identifying that, securing it, and validating it. So, again, a lot of these vendors do because they know in their lifeblood if something happens, there's high risk. Now, another slide here, we'll talk about really what the remedies are and really and whether or not you can collect on them. That's another deal. But suffice to say, they understand that their whole entire business model is at risk if this thing goes sideways, if there's security breaches, because ultimately all the people that trust and depend on them are going to leave. Again, the business and technology agility, ultimately I think this really boils down to lower risk. Okay, so risk assessment. This is a great, great comment. Ultimately, you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource accountability. You guys are, ultimately there's responsibility within the organization to ensure that things are secure, that, that how you manage your access, how you manage your encryption on your data, all of those things are standards that you should already know. And when you examine any sort of relationship with a cloud vendor, you should also be able to extend those same requirements out to your vendor. Ideally, if you could, you would put teeth in your SLAs. So, how many of you have audit standards for your data infrastructure? One, couple, I know you guys do it, CDCR. Most of you, half of you, don't know, yeah? Okay. So the notion would be, can your cloud service provider meet your audit standards? What are their internal audit standards? What are their reporting standards for their audit findings? And what are their corrective measures? So if you think about employing a cloud service provider, these are the type of things from an assessment perspective about security you really need to consider. I know one of the big deals is that pretty much everywhere we go, encryption's a major deal. Encryption transport, encryption at rest. And I guarantee you, probably if it's not on your white floor, it's got to be encrypted at rest. So then there are a number of applications that, that's going to impact their performance. But again, as a requirement, a security requirement, you would definitely want to be focused on that. Liability. So in the event of a security breach, what protocols are in place for notification? If you have that requirement in your environment, then obviously you need to match that up with whatever the requirement's going to be for your service provider. Notification. Here's the last one, remedies. If you read through the contract on most service providers, you're going to find the remedy is limited to you not paying for services. So ultimately, if you're talking about, something that's going to have teeth in it, I don't think refunding of your service costs has very many teeth. I would look at really, is there something that's more punitive in nature so that they've got skin in the game? So they're as interested in the security as you are. Here's another thing. So think about it this way. I can move into the cloud. So let's take a Salesforce, for example, or some other application-focused platform. It's a bear to get it in. How much effort do you think it's going to take to get it out? Or go from service provider A to service provider B. This is one of the biggest complaints that I see, is that once an organization has adopted a cloud provider mentality or a relationship, if they want out and how they're going to deal with migrating their stuff, they're way more interested in getting your business than they are losing it. Delivering on promises, on SLAs. Again, so how would I measure this? As a manager, I would want to be able to see a regular standard report that tells me what was the SLA, what was I measuring, what was their performance, and again, what happens if they don't meet it. Audit compliance, same type of deal. It's the notion that we've set these standards in place. Who's going to check it? Who's going to go back and review it? What happens if they don't meet my compliance requirements? Service termination or failure, as I spoke of. Integration. Here's another interesting thing. See, what's going to happen, and if you talk with people like Tiffany Bova from Gartner Group, this cloud's her area of expertise. She talks about a kind of utopian world where you can basically cobble together all of these services, and then you get what they call cloud integrators to basically integrate one cloud service to another cloud service. But the degree of difficulty, the more and more integration points you have, is really no different than you doing it. Unless there's a community of people that are very knowledgeable and that integration is actually standardized, the level of risk goes way up because now you're managing disparate vendors. And like anything else, how do you hold them accountable? So, cloud strategy takeaways. Really, again, to me, the shift, at least in my personal thinking, has been away from the coolness of the technology. I tell my people all the time, if you come to me and make a presentation and one of the words that you use in describing this is cool, we're going to have a conversation because that has a negative connotation to me. I want you to tell me in very specific terms, how does this solve a business problem? Ultimately, that's the language we should all be speaking. You know, technology's been great because it's been a greenfield. Everything's been growing so rapidly, so quickly, we all run out there to see what's in it for each one of us. But ultimately, the challenge is, how do I govern it? How do I operationalize it? How do I ensure that whatever reason I originally bought it for, I can continue to deliver that level of commitment and service and availability and reliability? Find the balance between fixed and variable costs. You know, that's going to be the real key, I think, over the next couple of years. Because, you know, I know, because we provide quotes to folks like CDCR, what the numbers look like behind all the heavy iron that they buy to do all the things they're trying to do. And it's substantial. Not to mention the burden it places on the staff to try and manage and maintain not only the implementation and the configuration, but the ongoing monitoring, the skill sets that are required. It is a very difficult thing to manage. And last time I checked, budgets weren't going north, they were going south. So it makes it increasingly more difficult to figure out how am I going to accomplish this. Infrastructure agility. Again, cloud is an option. Now, would I take, you know, one of the things that has been, let me try and be politically correct about this, was a great concept, was the notion of moving email to the cloud. Okay, email to the cloud is a great idea. Why? Because the infrastructure is so common. The service is so common. You would think that we could get it down so that I don't have to have my staff's time focused on, gee, our Exchange server's down again. We got a denial of service attack, all these things. So ultimately what I did was by outsourcing all of that particular commodity, that I was able to gain back some utilization of my own staff and get them focused on something else that was perhaps more important. And I know that it's, you know, we've talked with different customers and sometimes they're ecstatic because that was exactly how it worked for them. Others are not so much because they kind of got spoiled in the way they could deal with their own infrastructure. But either way, you're doing it for a business reason, and that's what you should be focused on. Again, the try before you buy. You know, this point has been in here 3 times for a reason. There's a lot of vendors out there trying to win and earn your business. The greatest part about it is force them to show you. It's the whole Missouri show me state thing of before I'm going to buy into this, I want you to be able to prove these points. I want you to be able to validate these points. And based on that, I can prove out maybe my business case. And that would be effective in terms of preparing for how you would present that to administration or whoever is going to approve. Lastly, consider your exit strategy. Nothing's forever. This is technology. 18 months from now, it's going to be something different. If you had to, how do you get out? People on the Titanic wondered, how were they going to get out? Okay. Question? That's awesome. I told you everything you needed to know, right? That's cool. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your attendance, and have a great conference.